The file is 47 pages long. It has no title. It was found inside a locked drawer in an office that had been empty for 11 days. 11 days since the man who worked there had not arrived for his morning briefing and had not been seen since. Inside the file is a list of names. 17 names. All of them are CIA assets. All of them are dead. The man who worked in that office had been employed by the Central Intelligence Agency for 31 years. He had passed every background check. He had completed every polygraph. He had been trusted with the kind of intelligence that shapes the decisions of presidents. His colleagues described him as brilliant, meticulous, and extraordinarily loyal. His name was not Thomas Harlow. It never had been. But to understand how a man trained by the KGB spent 3 decades at the heart of American intelligence, and what it took to finally find him, you need to go back to before any of this had a name. In 1974, a young Soviet intelligence officer named Alexei Volkov was given an assignment that the KGB called Operation Phantom Thread. He was 26 years old. He was fluent in English without an accent. He had spent 5 years in a program designed specifically to produce agents who could disappear into Western life completely. Not as visitors, not as temporary assets, but permanently. The program had a name inside the KGB's first chief directorate, the Legends Apartment. Its purpose was the construction of lives. Not covers, lives. Full biographies, from birth certificates to school records to tax returns. Every detail of Thomas Harlow's existence. His childhood in Baltimore, his degree from Georgetown, his 2 years in the Army, had been assembled over 18 months before Volkov ever set foot on American soil. He arrived in the United States in September of 1974 with a legend so complete that it would withstand 31 years of security clearances, 5 polygraph examinations, and 2 internal investigations that cleared him of suspicion both times. He applied to the CIA in 1975. He was accepted in 1976. He was assigned to the Soviet Division, the directorate most directly responsible for monitoring and dismantling KGB operations. The irony was not lost on Moscow Center. Elena Sorokina, his handler, later wrote in an internal KGB document that was the most elegant penetration in the directorate's history. She was not wrong, but the elegance was also the vulnerability. And in 2003, after 31 years, the vulnerability finally spoke. Before we go further, if stories told with this level of detail are what you are here for, subscribe to Deep Insight now so you never miss one. We go where the official record stops. Now, back to the moment that started all of this. To survive inside an intelligence agency for 3 decades, Volkov required more than convincing cover. He required discipline of a kind that almost no human being can sustain. Every day, inside, Langley was a performance. Every conversation, every office joke, every expression of frustration or loyalty or fatigue was calculated. He kept notes. Not operational notes, personal notes. A private record of the emotional responses he had observed in colleagues in similar situations, so that he could mirror them precisely when required. He documented how Americans expressed doubt, how they expressed trust, how they expressed the specific kind of institutional loyalty that intelligence officers develop over long careers. He studied these responses the way a musician studies a score. His tradecraft was extraordinary. Dead drops in Vienna, signal sites in the Washington metro, an emergency communication protocol built around the personal columns of 2 specific newspapers that had not published a triggering phrase in 22 years. He never used a radio. He never used an electronic channel the CIA could monitor. He passed information through methods that the agency's counterintelligence division was not looking for, because the division had been shaped, partly by Volkov himself, to look elsewhere. That was the deepest layer of the operation. It was not enough to survive inside the CIA. He had to shape what the CIA was looking for. And for 30 years he succeeded. He knew where the cameras were. He knew when the polygraphs were scheduled. And he knew, because he had read the counterintelligence doctrine that he had helped write, that the agency was searching for a certain kind of spy. He was a different kind entirely. The damage Volkov inflicted on American intelligence is, even in a composite account, almost impossible to comprehend in its totality. 17 confirmed assets dead. That is a number from the file in the empty drawer. But the number the analysts came to after the full damage assessment were higher. Operations compromised, sources burned, collection programs redirected away from genuine Soviet priorities, and toward targets that Moscow had pre-selected for CIA attention. He was not simply passing secrets. He was conducting the orchestra. Every piece of information he allowed to flow toward genuine CIA successes was a deliberate investment, a demonstration of his value that made his position more secure and his access deeper. He made the CIA better at some things, specifically so that it would trust him with the things that mattered to Moscow. The counterintelligence analyst who spent years reconstructing his career after his exposure described this as the most sophisticated active measure they had ever encountered. He did not simply exploit his access. He engineered it. He requested postings. He cultivated relationships. He inserted himself into the evaluation processes for new assets in regions where Moscow had the most to protect. One analyst, reviewing a decision Volkov had influenced in 1987 regarding a Soviet source in Beirut, said it quietly and without drama. The source was dead within 3 weeks of that meeting. We had been running him for 4 years. Nobody questioned the evaluation. Nobody had reason to. Martin Brennan was not looking for Alexei Volkov. He was looking for an anomaly in an expense report. In late 2002, Brennan had been assigned to an internal audit of travel expenditure in the Soviet, now Russia, division. It was administrative work. The kind of task given to a counterintelligence officer who had been asking difficult questions about asset losses for 7 years, and whose persistence had made him more inconvenient than useful. What he found in the expense records was this. Thomas Harlow had claimed reimbursement for a flight from Vienna to Washington in March of 1991. The receipt was correct. The flight details were correct. The problem was a single line in an immigration database that Brennan cross-referenced a habit. The kind of habit that counterintelligence develops in people who have been disappointed by obvious answers too many times. Harlow had entered the United States through Dulles Airport on the same date. That part matched. But the immigration entry showed him arriving at 1640. The flight, he had claimed expenses for landed at 1815. The same day, the same airport. A 95-minute gap that nobody had ever looked at. Brennan stared at that number for a long time. Then he pulled 10 years of travel records. Then 20. The anomalies were not numerous, but they were consistent. Volkov had always been careful. But careful, over 30 years, leaves a different kind of pattern than clean. Brennan put the legal pad down. He picked up the phone. He did not call his supervisor. The interrogation of Thomas Harlow began on a Thursday morning in February 2003. The room was in the basement of a facility that does not appear on any CIA organizational chart. 3 people were present. Brennan was not one of them. He had done his job. The job had been taken from him. What happened in that room over the next 4 days has been reconstructed from partially declassified deposition summaries and from the accounts of 2 individuals who have spoken on condition of anonymity. The picture that emerges is of a man who held his cover for 37 hours after the first direct confrontation with the travel evidence. 37 hours of calm, measured, absolutely coherent denial. It was the calmness that broke him, not the evidence. An interrogator who had spent 3 decades in the business later said that 37 hours of that quality of composure is not something an innocent man produces. Innocent men get angry. They get confused. They reach for inconsistencies in the accusation. Harlow reached for none of those things. He was too trained to get angry, and too tired, finally, after 31 years, to keep going. He gave his real name on a Friday afternoon. Alexei Volkov. Born March 15, 1948, in Leningrad. He gave it quietly, almost as a relief. The 17 names in the file, in the empty drawer. The assets, the operations, the 31 years. He had known, for a very long time, that would end this way. He had simply not known when. The travel receipt was not the answer. It was the beginning of the question that finally had to be asked. What the case of Alexei Volkov and the real cases that inspired it tells us is not simply that intelligence agencies can be penetrated. They can. They have been repeatedly, and by people less disciplined and less patient than the fictional Volkov. What it tells us is something more specific and more uncomfortable. The most dangerous threat to any intelligence organization is not the spy who looks like a spy. It is the one who has spent 3 decades making you trust them, who has made themselves indispensable, and in doing so has made themselves invisible. The system designed to catch them is only as good as the people willing to ask the question that nobody wants answered. Brennan found the thread not because the system worked. He found it because he was sitting in a room with a stack of expense reports and a habit he had developed from years of being told he was wrong. Drop a comment below. The question we want you to answer: what was the one detail in this story that you think should have been caught earlier, and why wasn't it? Subscribe to Deep Insight if you are not already here. The next file is already open.